Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Deb Clearwaters, and I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation at the museum. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Asian Art Museum sits is the ancestral home of the Ohlone peoples who stewarded this land for generations. We pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, traditions, and culture of their people across the nation. We extend our respect to these Ohlone Ramaytush tribes as well as other indigenous people who are present. If you want to learn about which indigenous territories you're standing on, you can text a number and it will tell you what native lands correspond to your region. And that number is 907-312-5085. And the bot will respond with the region. You send them your zip code or your city and state. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, If Objects Could Talk, the Complex Histories and Educational Power of Asian Art Collections. We will be discussing some of the social, historical, and legal conditions that enabled or constrained the collecting of Asian art over the past centuries, and also what could and should museums be doing now to research and interpret their collections and consult with represented communities about their heritage. And I will put the number in the, oh, thank you, Indra. I'll put the number in the chat, but Indra beat me to it. Thank you so much. This program is part of a series of conversations to critically re-examine Avery Brundage, the former IOC president, and the collection of Asian art he donated to San Francisco in 1959. His donation of 8,000 objects formed the nucleus of the Asian Art Museum when it was founded in 1966. The collection now numbers more than 18,000 artworks. These programs, combined with ongoing research on the provenance of the collection, will help frame these issues for the museum and our community for years to come. So if you'd like to know more about this ongoing series, which could last for a year, it's going to take as long as it takes until we're done delving into, and maybe we'll never be done, the issues of provenance and the research. We will be having programs on this topic. So you can sign up for email alerts from the museum on our website. And our first program about Brundage and the racism, anti-Semitism, and gender bias in the Olympics that he fostered is viewable on the museum's YouTube channel, which is Asian Art Museum. If you search on YouTube for that, you'll find our channel. And that featured two wonderful speakers, Harry Edwards and Jules Boykoff, as well as our own Jay Shu, the director of the museum. The third program in the series is in the works. I don't have the date or the exact speakers, but the topic is the healing power of truth and how museums are reflecting on their histories to change into the museums of tomorrow. So now let me turn to introducing our speakers for this evening. We have three speakers. The first speaker will be our own Robert Mintz. I'll introduce him last. And our second speaker will be Shareen Blair Brysac, and then she will be followed by Yiyou Wang. And each talk is going to be, well, Rob will be short, but Shireen and Daisy will both be about 20 minutes talking about different aspects of collecting practices and history. And then we will all gather together for a panel discussion. And then finally, we'll have audience Q&A. And I'll hope to get as many of your questions as possible. And to ask a question, ideally, you use the question tab at the bottom of your screen, but you can also use the chat. We'll monitor both of those channels for your questions as they arise. So feel free to ask them as they come up for you. So let me introduce Shireen. Shareen Blair Brysac is a former Emmy Award-winning television producer and documentary director for CBS. She was a co-author with her husband, Carl Meyer, of many books, such as The Tournament of Shadows, The Great Game, and The Race for Empire in Central Asia, which was chosen as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And which was also a finalist for the Lionel Gelber Prize for the world's best nonfiction book in English that seeks to deepen public debate on significant global issues. Her biography, Resisting Hitler, Mildred Harnack and the Red Orchestra, was a finalist for the LA Times Biography Book of the Year, and the German edition of the book was selected as one of the best books of the year by German reviewers. Kingmakers, The Invention of the Modern Middle East, written together with her husband, was chosen as one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post. The couple's book entitled Pax Ethnica, Where and Why Diversity Succeeds, was a finalist for the Dayton Peace Prize. The China Collectors, which may be known to many of the audience here tonight, America's century-long hunt for Asian art treasures, was named one of the Washington Post's Book of the Year in 2014. Brycek has also been contributing editor to Archaeology Magazine and a frequent contributor to Military History Quarterly. Her articles have also appeared in the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, World Policy Journal, and The Nation. Now I'd like to introduce Daisy. Daisy Wang is responsible for the Hong Kong Palace Museum's exhibition, research, collection, publication, learning, and public engagement programs. Sounds like many hats. She served as the Robert N. Shapiro Curator of Chinese and East Asian Art at the Peabody Essex Museum and the Chinese Art Specialist at the Smithsonian's Freer Sackler. There, with Jan Stewart, Wang co-curated the groundbreaking exhibition Empresses of China's Forbidden City and co-edited the publication, which was merited with the Smithsonian's Secretary's Research Prize in 2019. This exhibition was named one of the top 20 U.S. art exhibitions in 2019 by Hyperallergic. A specialist of the history of collecting lacquer and Qing imperial portraiture, Dr. Wang has published internationally. She's a recipient of a Getty Museum Leadership Fellowship and a Smithsonian Postdoctoral Fellowship, as well as a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. Finally, Robert Mintz, Deputy Director at the Asian Art Museum. Reporting to our director, Jay Shu, Robert provides strategic directions on exhibitions, education, interpretation, and public programs, and oversees the growth and development of the museum's collections. He leads the effort to program the museum's changing exhibitions anchored around the new Akiko Yamazaki and Jerry Yang Pavilion slated to open in 2020, which you see in the image behind me. His current research focuses on issues arising from the interrelationship of Chinese and Japanese works of art, with an emphasis on the decorative arts of the 18th and 19th centuries. With that, I would like to ask Rob to start us off.
Thank you so much. And it's nice to see everybody tonight, and not in my role as a housekeeper, but as a participant this time. I am going to share my screen with everybody so you can see what I'm talking about. And as Deb said, my presentation will be relatively short. I'll try to kind of race through things. It's really, the goal was to sort of frame some ideas and give you some sense of what we're going to be talking about. So we face a variety of challenges as we reconsider the Asian Art Museum and its collection and all of the things that we wind up stewarding as the current staff of this museum and the collection that surrounds us. Of course, let's make sure my slides go forward. Today, art museums like ours face a wide range of challenges. We are, after all, places where people congregate, and that's not something that we're currently encouraged to do, given the pandemic that continues to constrain our communities. But that's not the only challenge we face. We're also compelled to look at our history and the histories of those who've contributed to making the museum what it is today. We are, after all, a civic institution, and we like to point to the fact that we offer the public a space filled with things that are, at their very best, inspirational. We're also a place where learning happens through our interpretation of works of art produced by people and through cultures spread across the globe. We're also a place where art is made right here in our community. Through providing a stage, we serve as a community hub. And we bring people together around works of art that communicate across time and space, language, belief, and cultural practice. But we also serve a more practical function as a repository for works of art that have somehow found their way here to San Francisco from across Asia and across the globe. As a public museum, we serve as a permanent home for art, both old and new, that's separate from the commercial art environment. Some of the works that have arrived here and works that we care for came from people who spent decades searching for and investing in the collecting of the very best examples that they could find. From Lloyd Coateson, for example, we received a wonderful collection of over 900 Japanese baskets, and we now provide that collection a permanent home. Other works have come to us as single gifts, sometimes from artists who wish to leave their mark on the city by sharing works with the members of the community. These works from Zheng Daqian, currently on view in our Chinese painting gallery. You can go there tomorrow, by the way, since we're reopening. And of course, we still purchase things for the museum on the recommendation of our curatorial staff, allowing them to assist in telling fuller stories of culture, of art, and of history. And that takes us to the collection we house from Mr. Avery Brundage. As Deb said, 8,000 things comprise the collection, the founding collection of this museum that Mr. Brundage left beginning as early as 1959 and continuing up to his demise in 1975. So a series of donations. Today, Mr. Brundage's donations to the museum still make up over a third of the museum's collection. So Mr. Brundage, who we've been spending many hours this summer reconsidering and assessing, was a collector of Asian art who fashioned himself very much in the mode of mid-20th century collectors. He fashioned himself in the mode of these other 20th century collectors of Asian art. And each of these gentlemen that you see on the screen, they had differing levels of expertise and differing degrees of knowledge, but they all kind of looked alike. And I think it's an important point to remember that these men are presenting themselves in a particular way, and it reflects an aspect of their collecting practice. Brundage bought works from dealers, first in Chicago, and then New York, in London, in Paris, and through his contacts in Japan and in Hong Kong. He also consulted closely with specialists, some of whom were scholars of the arts and others who were deeply involved in the arts and antiques markets. Mr. Brundage listened carefully to all of them and took very careful notes, many of which survive at the museum, I think in hopes that he would be determined to be a discerning buyer. With help, Mr. Brundage built a collection of art from many parts of Asia, and his collection reflected the time in which he was collecting. And it reveals some of the biases that he held as he favored one culture or one nationality over another. Among the works, we find things that were at one time in other people's private collections. Some works we can trace back through the collections of several families, and others we can only say Mr. Brundage bought from a dealer while traveling, but each of these has a story to reveal. And that story started, in the case of these collection objects, in Asia, but then progressed through a chain of ownership and eventually found its way to our galleries. One case in point, which you will all be familiar with, is this famous Japanese sculpture of Bonten. That's the Japanese name for Brahma. It was once the property of the Kofuku Temple in Nara, Japan. This ancient temple housed some of Japan's most famous and most revered national treasures. But by the turn of the 20th century, the temple had fallen into disrepair. To raise funds for the temple, they held a sale of some of their damaged sculptures, and including our sculpture of Bonten. And this gentleman, Masuda Takashi, was the buyer of 16 of these sculptures from Kofukuji, including our Bonten. Masuda purchased those sculptures, he had them meticulously restored, and after his death, the sculptures stayed in his family's collection until 1965. In 1964, Avery Brundage was in Japan overseeing the Tokyo Olympic Games. And at the end of his service, doing the official welcoming of the games, he had the opportunity to be introduced to members of the Masuda family through a dealer friend in Japan who took him to see the Bonten sculpture. Over the course of the next year, Brundage would eventually secure that sculpture and buy it for the Asian Art Museum, which was due to open just a year later in 1966 in Golden Gate Park. Today, the sculpture stands proudly in the gallery with other Japanese Buddhist works and with its accompanying sculpture of Taishakuten or Indra. The two sculptures are the only examples of Nara period 8th century Japanese dry lacquer sculpture in the United States. And they are extraordinary examples of early Japanese Buddhist art. Still, when we survey our audiences, we talk to our audiences about what they think they're seeing in our gallery spaces. And we do tell them the story of perhaps the story of Bonten's travel to San Francisco. But our audiences respond to us, and I wanted to show you a few of their response cards from our current exhibition, Lost at Sea, that's in the Tateuchi Thematic Gallery. And I'll just read this to you. It says, "How did you get all the artifacts and stuffs in this museum?" I like the stuffs very much. Another one says, "Oh, I liked it. It was nice, even though it's made up of stolen goods." This Asian, she's Bengali, enjoyed it. And here's somebody who says, "I think materials and items should be excavated and given back to the original owners." Another card says, "I think those pieces should be returned back to the people that have created it." And another, that no matter what, I think that no matter what, that which has been lost should be returned to the community of its creator, no matter what. Death to collections and colonial hoarding. And then a nice little heart to soften the blow. And a final card here. I think that this one's hard to read. I think that the history of a nation should not be sold to any one person, but should be given back to its people and the nation of origin. So all of these responses from the public, we ask them what they think. And of course, the Lost at Sea exhibition asks them to think about who owns what's found under the sea. But all of these people are reflecting something. And I think the something was brought very clearly into focus in the 2018 Marvel movie Black Panther, which I hope many of you saw. And if you don't like superhero movies, it's a superhero movie. But it had a very poignant scene in which the character that you see in front of you walked into a museum. We won't specify exactly which museum he walked into, it's unspecified, but he walks in and he begins looking at the objects in the museum. And then he's approached by the security staff and the director of the museum, who is this, very intellectual looking and powerful woman. She steps up to him and protests that the works of art in the museum are not for sale. And the aptly named Killmonger, the gentleman you see right in front of you, retorts, "How do you think your ancestors got these? How do you think they paid fair price? Or do you think they paid fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?" And, I watched this scene in the movie and I found myself thinking, oh, this explains some of what we're seeing among the visitors to our museum. A kind of communication of the zeitgeist, if you will, that sort of collective thinking that suggests perhaps everything we see in museums has somehow been purloined, taken, stolen from the other cultures of the world that we see represented by those works in the museum. Of course, that story is a simplification that overlooks many, many different modes of acquisition and pathways along which works of art travel, as they are sometimes taken in warfare, sometimes literally stolen, and in many, many other cases, enter a kind of chain of ownership and a chain of stewardship, moving from collection to collection, and sometimes being bought and sold and shifted. I think it's sort of summed up in this one little comment card that just says, "I think I love repatriation," which to me feels like a little expression of kind of the current moment of thought. And I have to confess, I too love the concept of repatriation, but in literal practice, repatriation is, I will assure you, very hard. So today, when we're considering an addition to the collection, and I just show you an object from that Lost at Sea exhibition that was recently added to our collection, we ask a series of questions. We act with the knowledge that we need to be ready to answer the questions of people who walk in the door with this kind of prevailing contemporary thought. We strictly adhere to the guidelines that have been established by the Association of Art Museum Directors governing antiquities and archaeological objects. They're very specific about what museums should be cautious about considering accepting into their collections to avoid things that have actually been looted. We also look to the UNESCO treaty language governing national patrimony and cultural property. And we examine very closely the provenance history of each object to determine how it came to be a candidate for inclusion in the museum's collection. We also maintain close and positive relationships with representatives of modern Asian nations. So we regularly meet with the consuls general that are located here in San Francisco, and for nations that are not represented here, with consuls general around other parts of the West Coast or the embassies in Washington, DC. We also stay very closely in touch with community organizations representing the various cultural communities that are part of our audiences. Our desire, I think, as stewards within this museum today is to see the collection continue to grow. We want it to grow. And we want it to grow in an ever more inclusive way and be informed, be a collection that no longer is sort of mysterious, but rather is revealable to the public, so that the generations who come after us are able to look back at the objects that we've added to this collection and be assured that they see this moment in time and they see the museum's history representing our voices, our knowledge, and the values that we collectively embrace today as the representatives of this museum. With that, I will end, and we will hear from our two other speakers. I believe Shireen is going to be next, so I will stop sharing my screen.
All right, let me start. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jay and Deborah and Ron for inviting me. And we'll start off with this Royal Academy exhibition. Before the Touch Show, Thomas Hoving's big 1978 blockbuster show, there was the Royal Academy's exhibition of Chinese art in 1935-96 at Burlington House in London. And this is the poster for that. I begin with an apology. Although I have a degree in art history and archaeology, I am not an expert in Chinese antiquities. Rather, I am a historian and journalist who, along with my late husband, Carl Meyer, has written 2 books which deal with the plunder of antiquities. Now, the reason this is here is according to the account given by the first curator of Avery Brundage's collection, René Yvon Lefebvre d'Argençay. It was at this international exhibition of Chinese art in London at the Royal Academy's Burlington House Galleries that Brundage's interest in collecting Asian art began. Soft power politics played a large part in the exhibit. By 1935, Japan had started encroaching on Chinese territory, and nationalist Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek hoped to garner the world's attention by serving as honorary president of the exhibition. He succeeded. Beginning in mid-June, the British press notes that for the first time, the Chinese had sent their treasures abroad, suggesting that, quote, in spite of some clever propaganda for Japan, there is growing sympathy for China. With more than 3,000 objects displayed in 16 galleries, the International Exhibition of Chinese Art would attract more than 400,000 visitors, sell more than 100,000 catalogs, as well as numerous illustrated supplements, handbooks, and copies of journals, making it a success of blockbuster proportions. By 1935, the nationalists had moved the bulk of the imperial collections from Beijing to Shanghai to protect them from the encroaching Japanese. And since this would be the first time these artifacts from China's most important museums would be sent abroad, Western and Eastern connoisseurship could be compared side by side, and American collectors and museums would be making their international debut. In Shanghai, Chinese scholars complained that the all-British selection committee appeared to believe that they knew better what should be deemed Chinese art. And when it seemed likely that the borrowed objects were uninsured, they contended, quote, important and valuable treasures should not be sent abroad. Mindful of the looting that occurred during the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, they worried that, quote, once the art is acquired by the British Museum, it will never be allowed to leave the portals, whatever may be its value. In an effort to tighten control over the export of Chinese treasures, in 1909, the Qing government drew up measures for the protection of ancient sites. And more importantly, in 1930, the Chinese had enacted a law for the preservation of ancient objects. Yet the so-called foreign devils blamed for the plundering would be well represented. Next slide, please. Okay, on this slide, on the left, you see the large stele with a horse. That's the Emperor Taizong's favorite horse, Autumn Dew. He wrote a poem to this horse. And this was acquired by Penn Museum in 1920-21 for the dealer C.T. Liu. And now in the center, slightly to the center, you'll see this tall sculpture. It's a Bodhisattva, which is now in the Rockefeller collection at Kaikud. Abby Rockefeller collected it. Her favorite dealer was Yamanaka, and this was sold to her by Yamanaka. It's a Tang Dynasty limestone Bodhisattva. Business matters for the 36 games. The so-called Nazi Olympics brought Brundage frequently to Europe on International Olympic Committee business. In early 1936, while stopping in London, he happened to visit the Royal Academy exhibition. He spent a week studying the jades, bronzes, ceramics, and paintings, including 735 works from the imperial collections. Brundage discovered the availability of Chinese works of art and met and mixed with international dealers such as C.T. Liu and Sadichiro Yamanaka, and leading collectors, Sir Percival David, George Umerphopoulos, and Oscar Raphael, the latter being a leading bronze collector. By the end of the week, Brundage began to conceive the grandiose project of amassing a collection of Asian art that would surpass any other private collection. So writes his longtime advisor and the eventual curator of his collection, René Yvon Lefebvre d'Argençay. To see this collection, Brundage purchased 60 objects that had been on loan from private collections. His purchases were initially few and cautious, but gathered momentum during the 1939 trip around the world with his wife, Elizabeth. Their itinerary included Japan, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Saigon, Angkor, Bangkok, Penang, and Colombo. All the while, he kept buying Asian art. Lefebvre d'Argençay wrote, one of the first of a series of great coups for which he became famous was the formation of an unparalleled collection of ancient Chinese bronzes, which particularly appealed to him through their architectonic robustness, intricate delicacy of design, and superior craftsmanship. His curator also credited Brundage with being ahead of his time by focusing on these early bronzes and jades. In fact, the nation's Midwest was already experiencing a mini Bronze Age. In Detroit, Charles Lang Freer had amassed an exceptional collection of Asian art, which he would donate to the eponymous museum in our nation's capital. Reign Dynasty heir Arthur Pillsbury was moving from jades to collecting the bronzes he was leaving to the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And in Brundage's hometown, Chicago, a 14-minute drive from his quarters in the LaSalle Hotel, the Art Institute housed what was probably the best single collection of Chinese bronzes then in America, chosen by the publicity shy Kate Buckingham. Or if you wanted to board the International Limited, an overnight train direct from Chicago to Toronto, you could view the bronzes that were coming out of China's royal tombs, many of them from illicit digs, delivered straight to the doorstep of William White, the Anglican Bishop of Henan, by the peasants who were digging them up. Returning home to Canada, White became the curator of the Royal Ontario Museum's Far Eastern collection. Here we see a small 3-inch garment hook dating from 310 to 90 BCE. The jade dragon inset is about 300 years older than the inlaid bronze that surrounds it. Exhibited at the Academy show, it is one of the bronzes from the Buckingham's collection, which traveled from the Art Institute to Burlington House. I'm showing this because living in Chicago, Brundage would have had access to this superb collection of bronzes secured by Kate Buckingham with the help of curator Charles Kelly, who was later to advise Brundage on his acquisitions. But as Cleveland's former museum director and Asian art expert, Sherman Lee, you saw a picture of him earlier, Sherman Lee once remarked, when a curator comes back and says he discovered an important artwork, he really means a dealer discovered it. The two most important Asian art dealers before World War II were C.T. Liu and Sadachiro Yamanaki. During the 20s and 30s, Liu traveled from Paris to Chicago in the winter and settled with his stock at the Arts Club, where he was a member. His visits were highly anticipated by the Window City's clientele. As for Yamanaka and Company, they had a branch office in Chicago, 1 mile north of the Art Institute. Brundage, in explaining his devotion to Asian art said, "It's not a hobby, it's a disease. I've been broke ever since I purchased my first object." But he quickly became known for his ability to judge Asian art and for his rule, top quality, low price. It was also understood that he could return any object if he changed his mind about it. Wherever he went on Olympic business, he cultivated scholars and dealers. His official position was anything but a disadvantage. Abroad, he would seek advice on where bargains might be obtained from his host officials, and they in turn would invariably be anxious to please the International Olympic Committee president, often presenting, in Godfather fashion, a gift Brundage couldn't refuse. He was hardly unaware, but never acknowledged the confusion that his dual role might cause. Writing in the New Yorker in 1960, Robert Chaplin described a typical instance. 2 years ago, when he went to Japan for an IOC meeting, he was able, he feels, to achieve the perfect synthesis of sports and art that to him represents the true Olympic spirit. He arranged in advance to be met at the airport by 4 Japanese, 2 of them Olympic officials and 2 leading art experts. And during the next 2 days, he escorted the sportsmen to museums they had never seen and the art specialists to sports they had never seen. "It was great fun," says Brundage. "And when I saw the emperor afterward and told him what a service I had done for Japan, he agreed." Could we have, this is the iconic Rhinoceros, which appears in a lot of the brochures you've seen or publicity materials for the museum. It's kind of a favorite among visitors. It dates from the 11th century BCE and is a bronze, as you can see. It's noted for having an inscription inside, and it's really quite unique. It's the only one of its kind that so far has turned up. Abroad at home, Brundage's key purchase required extensive vetting by museum curators, provided gratis or on the cheap in hopes of further institutional awards. His ample homes were frugally crammed with his prizes. Visitors remarked on bathtubs filled with netsuke, while this unique Tang Dynasty rhinoceros was packed in a shoebox. As his trove grew in size and variety in the late 1940s, the staff and director of the Art Institute began to wonder what the childless Brundage planned to do with his treasures. "I got Brundage on the board," recalled Daniel Caton Rich, then the Institute's director. "His collection paralleled many of the things we already had. And I went to Brundage and asked him for part of it. But he wanted a separate series of galleries. We kept the idea in mind, but meanwhile, San Francisco came along, and I advised Brundage to put his collection on the West Coast, to the great annoyance, I may say, of Charles Keeley, one of our curators who'd been advising Brundage on acquisitions." These initial soundings were owed in part to an initiative taken by the University of California, Berkeley, art historian Catherine Caldwell. She saw in the Brundage collection an opportunity to fill an embarrassing gap in the city's museum constellation. Despite its large Chinese and Japanese communities, and despite San Francisco's reputation as a gateway to the Orient, there was no local museum collection of Asian art of any consequence. Pragmatically, Dr. Caldwell realized that City Hall would become interested only if it were approached by a group of socially active and prominent Bay Area residents. She organized just such a group to meet with George Christopher, the liberal Republican, who was then mayor of San Francisco. Duly impressed by the high-powered appeal, Christopher arranged for Brundage to be named an honorary citizen of San Francisco. Next, accompanied by Gwynne Fullis, board chairman of Standard Oil of California, and likewise a collector of Asian art, Mayor Christopher arrived by private aircraft with suitable brio at Brundage's winter retreat in Santa Barbara, a touch the mayor felt would lend the required drama to the occasion. At dinner, however, Brundage talked about everything except art. Finally, over coffee, Christopher blurted out the purpose of his visit, as the former mayor recalled in a 1970 interview. Mr. Brundage, Chicago is a great city. Mayor Daley, a great friend of mine, but your collection is too important to go to an already constructed museum. San Francisco is the gateway to the Orient. It has large Oriental communities, but we don't have any Oriental art to speak of. I want you to give this collection to us and to see to it that it is displayed in the way you think best. Brundage then agreed to donate his collection to a purpose-designed annex to the M.H. de Young Memorial Museum in Golden Gate Park. All costs were to be borne by the city. In due course, the city council approved a bond issue of $2,725,000. That's almost $24 million today, which was submitted to a referendum in June 1960. To promote a yes vote, advocates of the museum engaged the day's most popular political publicists, Whitaker and Baxter. The firm came up with a film presentation, which ended with a flourish. It is our great good fortune that this wonderful gift, one of the great gifts of all time, is ours for the voting. Not yet, not quite. The bond issue was approved by a substantial majority, and 2 days later, Brundage initialed the preliminary plans for the new gallery. But after the wing was formally opened in 1966, it became public knowledge that according to the contract signed in 1959, half the collection remained the property of Brundage or the Avery Brundage Foundation. This was partly attributable to tax laws, since the allowable contribution for works of art could not by law exceed 30% of the donor's annual income. There were palpable benefits in stretching a gift over a 25-year period. This meant that Brundage could at any time legally withdraw half his collection, a matter further complicated by the fact there was no agreed inventory of objects added to the collection since 1959. Hence, until the gift was final, Brundage could withdraw the better half of his collection, a threat which he now employed. Still, he could not be wholly blamed for taking advantage of a developing muddle. Brundage insisted that he, not the city, was paying the salary of his handpicked director, the French-born Lefebvre d'Argenset. Going further, Brundage contended that his collection should be under the control of a separate board of trustees. He also complained about the lack of adequate humidity controls in his name gallery. He had other grievances as well. During one of his Olympic visits to the Far East, he arranged for art from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to be sent to San Francisco. However, he did not make arrangements for the city to pay the transportation costs. When San Francisco refused to pay the shipping bills amounting to around $60,000, playing hardball, he had the artworks returned unopened to the countries of their origin. In 1967, Joseph Alioto was elected mayor. Having received a telegram from Brundage stating that he intended to move half of his collection to Los Angeles, Chicago, or Kansas City, the flustered mayor-elect took the next plane to Chicago. On entering the collector's suite at the LaSalle Hotel, The mayor immediately noticed a framed certificate designating Brundage an honorary citizen of Los Angeles. All right, Alioto recalled, saying, I've seen the certificate. You can take it down now. Yet despite this bold opening, he then yielded to the donors' demands. He agreed to form a separate 27-member board to administer the Brundage collection as an autonomous entity within the De Young Museum. He also accepted responsibility for raising an additional $1,500,000, again, over $10 million in 2020 dollars. These were terms that Brundage could have expected elsewhere. His threats to, these were better terms than Brundage could have expected elsewhere. His threats to approach were mainly bluff, as Alioto might have discovered had he contacted museums in Chicago, Kansas City, or Los Angeles. Over time, the Brundage collection was embedded in layers of later donations in what was renamed the Asian Art Museum, which was detached from the De Young Memorial Museum in Golden Gate Park and moved to a grander new site facing City Hall. In any case, the Bay Area is no longer bereft of Chinese art, and its Asian Art Museum and its associated Chongmun Lee Center for Asian Art are now prestigious global destinations for scholars and enthusiasts. This is Avery Brundage with a Chinese bronze mirror. We saw this earlier. So how can one sum up so contradictory a life? Through wit and wile, Avery Brundage proved a true professional in exploiting his amateur reputation on what was verily a field of dreams, to the eventual benefit of the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. As to the merits of his collection, a judicious and carefully calibrated assessment was provided by the seasoned scholar Lawrence Sickman, who had once been asked to be its curator. This was Sickman's evaluation. The collection of ancient bronzes, ceramics, and jades are of the very highest order. Due to an unusual set of circumstances, bronze sacrificial vessels and other objects of the archaic period were on the market in considerable quantities in the 1930s and early 1940s. These conditions made it possible to assemble a collection of such magnitude. I'll be happy to talk more about these special conditions for collecting in the 30s and 40s in the question period if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen. That was definitely things we didn't know, or I didn't know, about our collection's history and the involvement of our mayors. Such a fascinating mini-series in the making. Daisy, you're up.
Good morning from Hong Kong. And thank you, Shireen, for your very insightful talk, and I love your book. And also, as the Hong Kong Palace Museum is preparing its grand opening in 2022, I can understand how hard Jay, Rob, Deborah, and their colleagues are working for the reopening. So I cannot wait to say congratulations on October the 3rd for your reopening. Great work, and I love your museum. Thank you again for inviting me to share with our colleagues here, friends here, my research on the circulation of Chinese Buddhist sculptures, particularly through the lens of the dealer City Lu. So today, I'm going to share the story about the circulation, the global circulation of Chinese Buddhist sculptures from the Shangtangshan site.
Daisy, oh good, you're showing your screen. Thank you.
Yep. The talk is titled Chinese Stone Sculptures in Transit. I'm gonna start with the story. Let's take you back to 1915. These 3 life-sized stone sculptures were to be shipped from France to Philadelphia for the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Their owner, a Paris-based dealer of Chinese art, wrote to the museum director, quote, "We are sending 3 of those you chose per the first steamer. They're at the Packers, as there were real dangers now en route." So remember, this is during the First World War. So we might send 3 stone sculptures in 2 or 3 times by different ways in order to avoid any loss by submarines. The dealer continues, I could not get less than $60,000 for these three figures, but I hope that when you see the statues, you will recognize that they are absolutely the very, very best figures that have ever come out of China, end quote. So very hard bargainer. These pieces did not disappoint the museum. They were purchased later by the museum and featured very prominently at the opening exhibition of Chinese art at the newly constructed rotunda of the University Museum in 1916. So you can see two figures in the niches. The sculptures were supplied by C.T. Lu, one of the world's leading dealers of Chinese art. A native of China, C.T. Lu supplied high-quality Chinese art to major Euro-American collectors and museums for nearly 5 decades. Lu was responsible for the transaction of a large number of stone sculptures removed from the 6th century Shangtangshan Buddhist cave temples in northern China. So I wrote my dissertation on C.T. Lu, and on the left is a vintage photograph documenting his gallery in 1928, and also I took the new photos. So let's go inside his gallery back to 1920s. On the 5th floor was the Chinese sculpture room. At the corner was the head of a Bodhisattva, which was gifted by C.T. Lu to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1951. A number of stone sculptures Lu handled journeyed around the globe. C.T. Lu wrote about a number of stone sculptures. Quote, I received a cable from my Peking office telling me that they have secured 8 life-size stone statues. Not knowing how to dispose of these, I tried to get rid of them in China, but being unable to do so, they were finally shipped to me in Paris, end quote. So piecing together the archival documents, we can trace the itinerary of the travels of these stone sculptures. These are the sculptures he mentioned. So they were secured by Lu's agent in Beijing around 1909, following their removal from the Buddhist cave temple site. They were then shipped to Paris, possibly by the Trans-Siberian Railway. Then, in 1915, these sculptures probably left Paris from the French port city Le Havre, where they were embarked on a journey to the United States across the Atlantic Ocean. So I want to ask you, how did their meanings and the physicality changed as these stone sculptures traveled through Buddhist cave temples, commercial galleries, museums, and art historical narratives? The transaction between Lu and the University of Pennsylvania Museum signified a number of changes in the circulation and reception of Chinese art in the US from the 1915 onwards. As a result of the Americas' rise as the world's leading power in the early 1900s and the devastation of World War I in Europe, by the mid-1910s, the International Center for Collecting Chinese Art had shifted from Europe to the United States. It was from 1915 onward that interest in Chinese art, especially art of the early periods, spread to major American museums. In 1915, the Department of Far Eastern Art was established at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A year later, the University of Pennsylvania Museum opened to the public with an exhibition of Chinese art. In the same year, the ground for the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. was broken. In the first half of the 20th century, America became a major center for collecting of Chinese stone sculptures. Examples of Chinese stone sculptures can be found in nearly all major American museums that housed significant Chinese collections. So this is the installation view of the UPenn Museum. And this is an early installation view of the Metropolitan Museum Art Gallery. Also, American collectors were interested in Chinese Buddhist sculptures. The Rockefellers began to collect Buddhist sculptures in earnest after 1921. In their New York residence, they created their Chinese room, or also called Buddha room. Impressive Chinese Buddhist stone sculptures, such as those from the Shangtangshan Buddhist cave temples, proved to be particularly attractive to American public institutions and private collectors. During museum construction and expansion boom in the first half of the 20th century, these statement pieces from China helped museums to impress the public and fill their large empty new spaces. The first purchases of the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which opened to the public in 1923, include 2 relief panels from the Shangtangshan cave temples introduced by Cixi Lu in 1921. This panel you're looking at depicts the Western paradise of the Buddha Amitabha and measures over 130 inches in width. Those huge piece. In the second decade of the 20th century, when foreign buyers were few, large stone sculptures as a newly emerged category on the market were relatively inexpensive. So just give you a little bit of idea about the market conditions. The prospect of purchasing fine, rare objects, such as Chinese stone sculptures, at reasonable prices appeared to both dealers and collectors. Charles Lamb Freer, the founder of the Freer Gallery, purchased this stone sculpture from a Parisian dealer in 1913 for the sum of $5,000 US, while John D. Rockefeller Jr. was paying 10 times as much for a Qing enamel porcelain stitched figure on the left in 1915. For art dealers such as Cixi Lu, Yamanaka Sadajiro, the possibility of comparatively large profit margin in a newly emerged field proved extraordinarily attractive. The dealer Cixi Lu himself commented that the rising popularity of sculptures encouraged him to, quote, develop a new line in Chinese art, end quote. The attraction and eager reception of stone monuments from Shangtangshan is reflected in the Chinese art historical narratives in the Euro-American world. In 1925, Oswald Sirén, a leading authority on Chinese sculpture, describes several figurative pieces from Shangtangshan in his monograph, Chinese Sculptures from 5th to the 14th Century, as the maturest work of a golden age of Buddhist sculptures in China. While art historians, collectors, and museum professionals marvels at the aesthetic appeal of stone sculptures from Shangtangshan, traditional Chinese approaches to stone images are quite different. The renowned American sinologist John Ferguson introduced the Chinese term 石像, or stone figures, and argued that to the Chinese, these were religious emblems rather than items for aesthetic appreciation. He cautioned American museums that were very enthusiastic about so-called Chinese stone sculptures, quote, "It is sufficient for me to have called attention to the fact that whatever admiration they might elicit from Westerners, those traditions have been derived from Greece. These figures did not form an essential part of art of China." So he's saying that you look at these as beautiful art objects, but these were not part of the Chinese art traditions. For the Chinese intellectuals, very interesting, the primary attraction at the Shangtangshan cave temples were not stone sculptures, but rather inscriptions of dedicatory and sutra text engraved into facade and interior of the cave walls. So you can see in the slide. The inscriptions, which can be reproduced in the form of rubbing, not only provide historical information, but also preserve the writing of great calligraphers. These very different approaches to stone images may help to explain Why, in contrast to the popularity of the Xiangchangshan figurative sculptures in the Euro-American world, is the relative scarcity of interest in their iconography among the Chinese and the lack of interest in Xiangchangshan inscriptions among the Euro-American collectors, dealers, and scholars in the early 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, the Xiangchangshan Buddhist cave temples suffered severe damages. From the early 1910s onward, many sculptures disappeared from their site. So this is the image of the site today, but you can see what's inside the cave. Some actually were removed, you see in the red circle. Some were removed from the site, and some were actually, some of the actually were carved into the matrix of the rocks, but some of actually were removable. So inside the niches, these were modern reproductions to basic as substitutes for the removed original stone sculptures. So some of the removed sculptures reappeared on the market and entered public and private collections abroad. The damage on a massive scale of the Xiangchangshan site and other Buddhist cave temples in China coincide with the instability in China in the first few decades of the 20th century. Although laws and regulations that restricted antiquity exploitation were in existence as early as 1914, in China's Republican period, dealers like City-Lu found ways to secure and shipped out many large-scale, high-quality antiquities outside of China. The complexity of the life history of Xiangchangshan sculptures is illustrated by this kneeling monsters, originally located below the perimeter wall niche in North Cave of Northern Xiangchangshan. The monster were removed in or prior to 1937. The kneeling monster here on the left, you can see, was in a rather poor condition. You see cracks all over. It was for sale at antique shops in Beijing in the 1930s. It finally made its way to the United States, where City-Lu put it on the market after restoration. So this is after restoration. So this is what it looks like now in the storage. On the back of the monster is a concrete mounting block to hold the crackled piece all together. The repairs were quite visible here. The monster, by the way, weighs 435 pounds, so huge and heavy. This kneeling monster appeared as a poster boy on the back cover of the 1940 Art News and the Lu Sales Catalog, an exhibition of Chinese stone sculptures in 1940. The piece, along with another monster, were purchased by the Swiss banker, art patron. These two monsters were purchased by the Swiss banker, art patron, and collector, Edward von der Heydt in 1941. So soon after it was exhibited in New York in City-Lu's gallery. During World War II, von der Heydt set up American Trust, which between 1941 and 1947 acquired 44 objects on his behalf, including these two kneeling monsters through City-Lu. Von der Heydt agreed to place them as long-term loans at the Buffalo Museum of Science in Buffalo, New York, as a way to avoid potential destruction during the war. After war ended, he was charged with financially supporting German intelligence. A Swiss military court, however, acquitted him of all charges in 1949. In 1947, he donated his entire non-European collection to the Rydberg Museum in Zurich. In 1951, under the provision of Trading with the Enemy Act, the trust purchased art in the Buffalo Museum was seized by the Alien Property Office of the United States Department of Justice. Von der Heydt sued the United States government in 1956 for the return of the seized objects, but the suit was dismissed. President Kennedy authorized transfer of the objects from the Buffalo Museum to the Smithsonian Institution in 1964, followed by a congressional bill signed 2 years later to endorse donation of the works, including the two monsters, to the Smithsonian. Between the 1960s and 1970s, the objects was housed in the National Museum of Natural History And finally, two stone monsters were transferred to the Freer Gallery Art in 1973 and the accession later. So you can see that their global journey is just way much more complex than you can imagine. In their global journeys, Shangchangshan sculptures were viewed not only as objects of religion, art, and history by various groups of viewers, but also as national cultural patrimonies. Since 2008, the Freer Gallery Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery have been conducting provenance research focusing on World War II and made the information available to the public on the website. So you can check out their website for the provenance history or ownership history of many objects that they researched and made it publicly available. So I want to end with a positive note so we can look into the future. In response to the massive destruction of the Shangchangshan Buddhist cave temples in the 20th century, the University of Chicago Center for the Art of East Asia launched in 2004 the Shangchangshan Cave Project to identify, locate, research, and document dispersed sculptures outside of China through the use of very sophisticated 3D scanning equipment, as well as study of cave sites in collaboration with Chinese institutions and local government. So you can see a sample of their 3D scanned sculpture piece. Also, a digital archive is developed to reconstruct the site in a virtual form. So idea is they go to the site and they scanned the site, the cave temples, and also they scanned in 3D dispersed sculptures dispersed in different museums and different collections in the hope that they can digitally join them. And they were very successful. Drawing on this research, the exhibition titled Echoes of the Past, the Buddhist Cave Temples of Shangchangshan opened a Smart Museum at the University of Chicago in 2010. Later, the exhibition was presented at Sackler Museum in Washington, D.C. and other venues in the United States. So this is the installation view at the Sackler Gallery. In the Sackler presentation, objects like this previously dispersed or displayed more or less as isolated works of art were grouped according to their original location and relationship. The exhibition also provided very rich didactic materials to help viewers to see the exhibition, to see the objects in their historical, religious, and social context. This is also a digital cave that the visitors can walk in. So I want to end with a quote from C.T. Liu. He talked about the idea of art has no frontier. So let's look at this very problematic and interesting statement. So he said, quote, "I feel so ashamed to have been one of the sources by which these national treasures have been dispersed. China has lost its treasures, but our only consolation is, as art has no frontiers, these sculptures going forth into the world, admired by scholars as well as the public, may do more good for China than any living ambassador," end quote. Thank you very much.
So that we can get all three of us here. Deb is compiling some of the questions from our audience, which have been flowing in while the two of you were talking, but I thought maybe it would be a good idea to just take a moment and think a little bit about what ties some of these things that you've been talking about together. And this may sound crass, but the thing that really strikes me is both of you spoke in the middle of your presentations about money, that money played this kind of key role. And Shireen, we at the museum, we all quote Avery Brundage on the buy the best quality for the lowest price, kind of statement, because money clearly was a big question mark and driver for Brundage in his collecting too. But I think about the current moment and the ways in which we as museum professionals are being encouraged to think about collections, think about their social function, their meaning culturally, historically, as possessions of people around the world, cultures that produce them or cultures that appreciate them. and we always distance ourselves from questions of money. You know, we don't talk about how valuable something is. We don't talk about sometimes we talk about what it costs to buy it, but we try to put that in the context of its moment. And I just wonder what you two think, as you've studied dealers and you've studied collectors' behaviors, where do you put money in that sort of continuum of thinking about art, appreciating art, and collecting art?
Well, I think you can't get around it, unfortunately. I don't know, Debbie, do you have that email that I sent you with the picture of the bronze? One of the bronze that was displayed in the Burlington House exhibit in '36 was just sold at Asia Week for $8 million, which was twice its estimate. Now, probably when it was bought the first time around, it was probably maybe $5,000. So that the people that collect tend to like appreciation, but more importantly, I would think it's the tax code in the United States. And if I can mention what I consider one of the real scandals was the Sackler collection in the Met, where the Chinese collection, that's the bronze that was sold. But the Sackler collection, Mr. Sackler of the Sackler family with the opioid epidemic, but he was dead before that started, so he can't be blamed for that. Mr. Sackler had a deal with the Met where for years they stored his collection, and he paid for his own curator, but nobody else could go into this collection. He stored it for years and years and years. And then, of course, he decided to give it to his own museum in Washington. It's on the mall opposite the Freer Museum. Okay, but what's left in the Met is the Sackler Gallery of Chinese Art. And what Sackler did was buy from the Met a number of objects that they already had, that other people had donated them. And he bought them for what the original prices were. But he donated them for what the prices were when he made the donation, which was 10, 20 times more. So he got this huge tax break. And that's part of the problem is this monetization of money with donors and the tax write-offs. And one of the scams with donors is often they loan things, and then eventually with a promise that they will donate them later. And it's not true of just Chinese art, it's true of all art. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art had this famous Gertrude Stein collection with Mr. Paley and Mr. Whitney, and I forget who the third millionaire was, but they kept it in their houses, in their apartments for all this time. And then when they died, it would be donated. But meanwhile, they had the use of it, the pleasure of it and all. So that's my contribution.
If I can add to Shireen's comment is that as a scholar of history of collecting Chinese art, it's crucial to study these figures, these numbers. I think that, I was very lucky because I worked several years at the Freer Sackler galleries, and I had access to, and in fact, everybody have access to their archives. And you can look at Charles Lanfear's receipts. And he was a bookkeeper from the very beginning, and he was an industrialist, and he kept pretty much every receipt. So it's just such a treasure trove for a scholar like myself who are interested in the market conditions, because when you look at the figures, I'm terrible at math, but using very simple Excel spreadsheets, I can see market trends. I can see why he was interested in certain things, in addition to his knowledge about art. Because, for example, I'm sharing my new book. This is the monograph on Charles Lanfear and his collecting of Chinese art, recently published by Shanghai fine art publisher. I was looking at all the purchases he made in the year 1916. And I looked at the total value of different categories. For example, painting. He actually spent $157,000 US to buy 177 paintings. He spent $46,000 to purchase 68 sculptures, mainly Chinese Buddhist stone sculptures. And I was able to look at other categories as well. So in fact, he paid a lot of money for sculptures, and also look at the average price for each piece. In fact, he spent a lot of money on painting, and their average price is about $800. And the average price for stone sculptures is less, $677. I thought, oh, okay, you know, he was very interested in painting and stone sculptures. But when I look at textiles, he paid $35,000 for 36 pieces. And the average value for each textile he paid is higher than painting. He was buying some of the most amazing important paintings and some of the amazing stone sculptures. But I was so surprised to see Charles Lanfear, he loved textiles. And although he just spent so much money, but the average price is high. So that really is a surprising discovery for me. The other thing is very important to mention is that when you look at Rockefeller and look at Charles Lanfear, you notice that Charles Lanfear, in terms of financial resources, he is not comparable to the Rockefellers. So he has to collect very smartly and strategically. So he look at Chinese stone sculptures because their average price is much lower than the average price that Rockefeller was paying to purchase these Ming and Qing porcelain figures. So I think that is also related to the price, in addition to, you know, their knowledge about Chinese art.
No, I find it fascinating. I know Deb she appears on her face to have the questions lined up, and I wonder if we should turn to those questions.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, in the last 10 minutes or so that we have, and this first question, I'm going to go a little bit out of order because it relates to what Daisy was just talking about, and I just want to make sure that this question is answered. It has to do with why Buddhist stone sculptures were so attractive to U.S. collectors and the public, and clearly there were market forces behind it, but was there some other quality that you believe was attractive? And it was so fascinating to hear that the Chinese intellectuals were interested in calligraphy, but the Americans were attracted to the figural sculpture. Is there more to it than that you could share?
Sure. I think it has to do with the canon and the museum context, art museum context, because a lot of museums will collect them as art. Remember, many large museums were encyclopedic museums, meaning that they're also collecting Greek sculptures and Roman sculptures. So in the early decades of the 20th century, you can see that a lot of the scholars, Western scholars writing about Chinese art, they use the Western art canon to try to describe and categorize and validate Chinese stone sculptures. And that is precisely, if you look at the Shangtangshan stone sculptures, they're quite unusual. They're very naturalistic, very three-dimensional. I think that's also why, you know, this type of stone sculptures produced in that particular site in the 6th century were particularly popular because they fit in. The other thing I want to mention is that also during my research project, I found also, you know, there was also an interest in general in American and European world, interest in the spiritual aspect of art. And again, you know, Buddhism, and not just Chinese Buddhism, but think about the Japanese Buddhist sculptures as well. And they became very popular for that reason as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's shift gears away from China.
Shireen also had
oh, did you? I'm sorry, Shireen.
I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to add one thing, that these Buddhist rooms, Isabel Stewart Gardner had one, Agnes Meyer, whose Buddhist art ended up in the Freer. She was a great friend of Freer's.
Yep.
And Abby Rockefeller all had these Buddhist rooms, and they had sort of Buddhist people come in and help them with the study of Buddhism. So there was kind of a fad in the 1920s for Buddhism, 1910s, 20s, and 30s, particularly among the ladies.
Yeah. So shifting away from China to a country like Syria, the question is, how do you think about art from a country like Syria? I think, Rob, you could talk a little bit about, do we handle Syrian art in our collection, but maybe also recent news about looting, active looting that's happening in Syria today.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just mentioning Syria sort of raises the red flag of, countries that are currently in conflict. And of course, works of art, ancient works of really classical Greek and Roman sculpture come out of Syria and are in the marketplace today and are most likely stolen or removed under duress of some sort. So we at the Asian Art Museum, we look at Syria as an outpost of West Asia, kind of the westernmost of West Asia, nearly. And from its own kind of internal cultural identity, it is a part of West Asian society and early West Asian culture. But of course, Greek and Roman Syria, that's not part of our story. It really becomes the story of the Western canon. And I think, Daisy, you raised that point, that early collections of Chinese sculpture sort of use the vocabulary, at least, or perhaps appeal to the same sentiments as the Western canonical Greek and Roman figural sculpture tradition. And I think, we don't see it that way, but we would look at Syrian Islamic art and say, this is part of the great tradition that reaches from that part of the world through Iraq and, through formerly Persia, Iran, all the way into India, and is part of a kind of grand Muslim tradition of image making. But I don't know, Shireen, did you ever work at all with Syrian art?
Well, actually, what I majored in was Mezpot. Yeah.
And that too is right now in the looting world a real problem.
I would say that one of the arguments that's been used, and it was certainly used by the Chinese dealers, was that they saved the art from being destroyed by the Chinese. More recent people have said, well, the Cultural Revolution, it would have all been destroyed, so it's better that it's here. That's one of the arguments that's been made. And when something like Bamiyan happens in Afghanistan, where they destroyed those Buddhist sculptures, it of course gives people backing for what they were saying already, that yes, we should collect all this stuff because they'll be safe here. And that's sort of the curator as opposed to the archaeologist argument.
Thank
you.
I
always have trouble with that.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? It depends on who you talk to. There's a question about Liu and how did he get started as a dealer? What were his connections in China that enabled him to obtain or purchase works of art?
I'll get started. Yeah, I'll get started. Liu is a very legendary figure. In fact, some of friends in Hong Kong is trying to produce a film, and they approached some directors about him. So he actually started to work in the Chinese embassy in Paris in the early years of in late 19th century and early 20th century, and he established an antique firm. Actually, with the support of a diplomat, Chinese diplomat. At the time, it was reported that some of the profit of this antique firm was actually supporting the revolutionary cause by Sun Zhongshan, Sun Yat-sen. So it's actually really interesting how his ties with the government at the time actually helped him. And Liu has a very complicated relation later on in the Republican period, and I found an archival document in the National Archives actually on his that was a shipping, basically is a passenger record. When he entered the United States, his identity was a Chinese diplomat to Washington DC. So it's I think that he has a lot of high-level connections with the government to help him to get things out more easily than others. But also, I think that he hired a lot of agents. He has a lot of partners in many cities in China, help him to source locally antiquities. But I want to hear what Shireen has to say about Lu as well.
And if you want to speak about other dealers, other networks of trade, that's another question. What were the networks of trade between the sites these artworks originated in and the dealers who sold them?
Well, I would like to talk about, shifted slightly to this 1930 law that the Chinese had. The Chinese, you know, it was always said, well, the Chinese don't protect their sites. They said that about the Italians. They've said that about the Greeks. And that the argument, which was given in 1933, Sickman, who later became the director of the Kansas City Museum that we've talked about him before. There was I forget his T.L. Yuen, who was the Academy Sinica person in China, and he had a correspondence with Sickman, which was in our book, about Sickman said, well, you should protect your sites, or we should try and remain, you know, she's talking about Buddhist cave sites, because Long Men, which is one of the most famous ones that's been looted systematically, that they should, that maybe there could be American funding, whatever, and that they could protect the site. And Mr. Yuen was arguing that no, once it's in the you know, the dealers have it, it's too late. And you guys, you dealers, C.T. Lewin and others, have created a market. These people wouldn't loot the sites if there wasn't a way they could sell it. And they're poor peasants and there's nothing that can be done. You have to stop, you know, selling it, buying it, whatever. And of course, nothing happened. You know, the first time Sickman, it's in the book. Sickman, first time he saw it in 1932. There's two great, they're 11 feet. There's two great stelae. One is in the Met and one is in Kansas City, of the procession of the emperor and the procession of the empress from the Wei dynasty. And they were, when he was first there in 1932, he made rubbings. They were all intact. By 1933, some heads were missing. They had already started looting this site. And that's when this correspondence took place. So that's been the problem, is that the protecting the sites. These countries didn't have money. China, during all those periods of the 20s and 30s, when the looting was really happening, didn't have the money to protect the sites. They had very poor peasants. There was warlords. There was hardly any, you know, it was a mess politically. In China. So it was very hard to do anything to protect the sites. And even now, I don't know, maybe probably Daisy knows a lot more about this than I do, since she's in Hong Kong, but there's a lot coming through Hong Kong still, right?
Hong Kong is a free port.
And in spite of all the restrictions that the Chinese have, there's still stuff coming out. It's hard to stop once you've got a market. And also now people argue, well, there's a big internal market in China, that the Chinese buy their own stuff and they sell their own stuff. The People's Liberation Army has this gallery and all of that. So
I think Jay knows a lot about archaeology today in China. I think that you know, currently, you know, Chinese government is working very hard to protect antiquities, particularly objects from archaeological sites. But the issue is China is too big. And there's archaeological discoveries every day. There are a lot of salvage archaeological projects. There are, you know, vast construction projects. Even back to 19-teens, you know, it's railway construction. People dug up things. I think there are definitely challenges, but also I think that the Chinese folks are working very hard to protect antiquities and archaeological materials.
I'm gonna stretch our time just a few more minutes because there's so many good questions. So let's just take a few more minutes. Someone wants to hear about your museum, Daisy. So that's one question. And the other question is, are there any women involved in these early collecting practices? And finally, did the Chinese collectors remove the calligraphy pieces they liked from the caves? So I'm going to let you guys pick from those three questions.
if I may, that I want to talk a little bit about the Hong Kong Palace Museum, and just very quickly, and thank you for that question. We are going to open in late June 2022. And we're not a branch museum of the Palace Museum in Beijing, known as the Forbidden City. We are a close partner of the Palace Museum in Beijing. Currently, we are preparing 9 open exhibitions to fill all the gallery spaces, working very hard. 7 exhibitions that draw on loans from Palace Museum. We're looking at about 800 loans of treasures from the Forbidden City, which will be the largest single loan group ever came out of the Palace Museum in its history. And also we have 2 special exhibition galleries for both Chinese and non-Chinese art objects. And for the opening, in addition to Palace Museum loans, we're also going to feature some of the things from Hong Kong collections, as well as a gallery designed especially for children and their families. So that's a very brief introduction to the museum and exciting upcoming exhibitions.
Thank you. Any comments about the calligraphy that was in the caves or women collectors?
Well, I'll talk about a couple of
Sure, yeah, Shireen, please.
Well, I mentioned Kate Buckingham from Chicago, who had this fabulous collection of Chinese bronze. She had some other things, but unlike Mr. Brundage, she was very shy and she gave everything in her sister's name. So she was the collector, but the sisters, when you go there, it's Maud, Lucy Maud or Maud Lucy, who was given as a donor. And the other one that I particularly liked a lot because she was friendly with Charles Freer and they talked a lot about things was Agnes Meyer. And she had a very good eye. She was Kay Graham's, the Washington.
Yes, mother.
And so she even wrote a book about a Chinese artist. Do you remember what the name of that artist was, Daisy? She wrote a book about.
No, I couldn't remember. She was a kind of, she was very young when she met Charles Freer, and they were buying things together. When there's a group of things, Freer was split and asked him to choose, what they like. So they're very close partner. And also, she was a board member. She became a board member, and her objects were donated to the Freer Gallery because Freer was very strict about donation, but he allowed the Meyers to donate things they collected to the Freer Gallery. In fact, including an object from the Shangtangshan Buddhist cave temples as well.
That brings up a question that I have of Daisy, because I wondered when you talked about the German collector, Vanderheit. How was the Freer, because of the restrictions on the will of Freer, that he didn't want anybody else's, they didn't want to lend anything and he didn't want to have and borrow anything. How did those objects actually legally end up in the hands of the Freer? Okay.
So this is interesting. So most people thought, oh, Freer, when he passed away, he left a will. He actually also changed his will a couple of times. And later on, what happened is that several of his friends, including the Meyers, they could donate objects to the Freer. And also even today, Freer Gallery can acquire objects, but of course, very selectively. Now, the good news is you also have Sackler, the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery. So the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery also acquire things. But when curators look at some potential acquisitions, they always have to debate: is this for Freer? Is this for Sackler? When I was working there, it's kind of yin and yang approach. Things are more kind of iconic, and the best of the best we usually go to the Freer, And other things sometimes go to the Sackler, and also Sackler provide opportunities for special exhibitions, such as the Shangtangshan Buddhist cave exhibitions I mentioned in my presentation. Going back to the calligraphy question about the inscription question, is that in fact early, I have to look at the dates. If I remember correctly, 30s and 40s, that the Chinese scholars published a scholarly book about inscriptions at the Shangtangshan, but not a illustration or a photo of those Buddhist sculptures. So their main interest is calligraphy and inscription, basically, and the sutra as well, sutra text as well. I am not aware of, I'm aware of rubbings from the site. This is the way to basically you actually transfer the writings to a piece of paper using the method called rubbing. But I'm not aware of things on the market, basically the whole piece chiseled out of the cave with the inscription that I wasn't aware of. There might be some damages for sure on the site, but I would say the most severe damages were to those stone sculptures.
Well, Rob, I think we should probably close our discussion there. Do you want to say any final words about the museum and where we're going to take this next, or?
The only thing I'll say is, well, first I'll say thanks to Shireen and Daisy for giving us some great commentary on some of these early dealers who allowed our early collectors to form the collection that we have. But I think from our collective perspective today, we want to be responsible global citizens. We want to take the initiative to study our collection, to examine its history and its heritage. And the markets in art have always been challenges to preservation and to just the world of art for everybody is not necessarily the world of art for, and that's Deb typing. It's really great.
Sorry.
All right. But it's not necessarily the world of art for the masses, and the museum becomes the intercessor. We are the ones in between that allow this art to be seen by anyone in the public and to be interpreted and understood. And it's our responsibility to type. I'm talking about you, Deb, but rather to share whatever knowledge and whatever awareness we have about those people whose lives came into contact with these works in the past. So my hope is our provenances become long and elaborate, and you'll get to come to the museum and tell us where our story can be embellished even further based on your deep knowledge.
Thank you so much to our speakers and to our AV technician, John, and all the staff at the museum, Indra, and the marketing team to help us put these programs together.
Also, I want to thank all the participants, and there's some old friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for coming out.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.